She had dreamed of this moment her entire life. The dress, the vows, the promises of forever. For Rachel, her wedding day was everything she ever wanted. A beautiful ceremony, surrounded by family, friends, and the man she thought she would spend the rest of her days with. It was supposed to be the happiest time of her life, the beginning of a fairy tale. But just 3 days after saying, "I do," everything came crashing down in the most horrific way imaginable. What was supposed to be the start of a new chapter ended with bloodshed and betrayal that no one could have predicted. In the quiet of their suburban home, the man she had promised to love forever, the man she thought she knew better than anyone, did something no one could have foreseen. He shot her 10 times, after catching her in the arms of someone else, someone she should have been able to trust. Their pastor. What would drive a man to murder the woman he vowed to protect? What dark secret had been festering in the background, lurking beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect marriage? And just how involved was the pastor in this twisted tale of passion, betrayal, and rage? Rachel was no angel. She was far from perfect, but this wasn't the ending anyone had imagined for her. No one could have predicted the explosive chain of events that led to that fateful night, a night that shattered lives forever. What went wrong? How did a relationship built on love and trust descend into this horrifying mess? As we unpack the twisted details of the story, we'll explore the darkness that simmered beneath the surface of what appeared to be a perfect marriage. What happened when the honeymoon ended? Was it just a momentary lapse in judgment, or something far more sinister? How did Rachel's betrayal unravel a love that had seemed so solid? And who was really to blame? Stick with me as we delve into a chilling account of obsession, betrayal, and murder that will leave you questioning how well we really know the people closest to us. And, more importantly, how little we sometimes know about the secrets they are hiding. Before we continue, please subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell to stay updated. Your support means the world to us, and we truly appreciate it. Thank you. Rachel had always envisioned the perfect wedding. Every little girl dreams of it. A grand ceremony, a white dress, the vows exchanged under a sky full of hope. For Rachel, it wasn't just a dream. It was her fairy tale. She had spent countless nights imagining this day, piecing together the details from movies, magazines, and conversations with friends. The flowers, the cake, the venue, all of it had to be just right. So when she met John, a charming, thoughtful man who seemed to fit every idea she had of a perfect partner, it felt like destiny. This was the man she would grow old with. This was the man she had been waiting for. After several months of dating, long enough for Rachel to believe she knew him inside and out, John proposed. It was everything she had imagined. A quiet, intimate moment on a rainy evening, with John getting down on one knee and holding out a ring, asking her to be his forever. The answer was obvious. Yes. Yes to the future. Yes to a lifetime of shared memories. Yes to the fairy tale. Their wedding was a scene out of a romance movie. The venue, a beautiful church with stained glass windows, gleamed in the soft afternoon sunlight. Family and friends gathered to witness the union of two people who seemed to have it all. The music played, the vows were exchanged, and Rachel couldn't help but feel that this was the beginning of everything she had ever wanted. She looked into John's eyes and believed with every fiber of her being that their future was secure, solid, unshakable, and filled with love. The first few days of their marriage were full of love, promise, and excitement. Rachel woke up every morning with a smile, surrounded by the man she loved. Everything seemed to fall into place effortlessly. Their honeymoon, a week-long escape to a secluded beach resort, felt like a dream. Long walks along the shore, candlelit dinners, and stolen kisses under the stars. This was the life she had always imagined. They laughed together, danced together, and spoke about the future as though nothing could ever tear them apart. But beneath the surface, something had begun to shift. Rachel was so caught up in the dream that she didn't notice it at first. Those small, seemingly insignificant moments when John began to act different. In the quiet moments, when the laughter faded, she would catch him watching her more closely, as if he were studying her every move. His affection seemed to deepen, but so did his scrutiny. There were small things Rachel brushed off at the time. John had always been a bit possessive, but at first it felt like love, like he cared too much. But as the days passed, she began to feel the weight of his gaze more and more. The way his eyes lingered a little too long when she spoke to a man at the resort. The way he would pull her aside, asking why she seemed distant, why she laughed too much at the jokes of the other guests. His jealousy was subtle, but present, undeniable in its quiet intensity. And then there were the phone calls. Rachel didn't think much of them at first, late-night calls from her friends, her family. Sometimes she would step outside to talk in private, but she didn't see the harm. But John's eyes followed her whenever she slipped away, as though he couldn't quite place his trust in her. Every time she returned, he would ask who it was, what they talked about. Nothing seemed amiss, just the normal curiosity of a newlywed couple. But looking back, Rachel would realize these little moments were the first cracks in their perfect image of each other. For John, it wasn't just jealousy. It was a growing sense of unease, a gnawing feeling deep in his gut that something wasn't right. Rachel, in his eyes, had always been so perfect. Too perfect. How could a woman like her, smart, beautiful, charming, be so content with a man like him? She deserved better, didn't she? These thoughts circled in his mind as the days went by, festering in the shadows of his insecurities. He had always been a man who had to work hard for everything he had. His career, his friendships, even his love life. So why did it seem so easy for Rachel? Why did she have so many options? And why, when she laughed a little too freely with other men, did he feel the sting of doubt creeping into his heart? John tried to ignore these thoughts, telling himself they were just fleeting worries. But the more he pushed them away, the more they consumed him. His mind raced, trying to rationalize his feelings. Was he paranoid? Or was there something he wasn't seeing? The phone calls, the late nights, her behavior when they were out together, always a little too friendly with other men. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that Rachel was hiding something from him. The idea of betrayal began to take root in his mind, like a poisonous seed that had found fertile ground. It wasn't long before he began to question her every move, replaying the smallest interactions over and over in his head. He couldn't help but wonder, did she really love him? Or was she just playing a part in the life he had built for them? Rachel, on the other hand, was blissfully unaware of the tension building around her. She was wrapped up in her own excitement, believing her marriage was as perfect as she had always dreamed it would be. But even she began to notice John's behavior was changing. His possessiveness, his growing need for reassurance. She attributed it to the nerves of marriage, the natural insecurities that surface when two people vow to spend their lives together. But she didn't realize how deep John's doubts were running, or how dangerously close they were to spilling over into something far darker. Everything had been a whirlwind for Rachel and John. The excitement of the wedding had barely worn off when the harsh reality of their new life together began to set in. The honeymoon period, once full of joy, was now fading into something less certain. While Rachel tried to keep up the illusion of happiness, John had started to feel an unease that he couldn't shake. The doubts, the jealousy, the insecurities. They had all been simmering beneath the surface, but nothing prepared him for what happened just 3 days after their wedding. That evening, John returned home earlier than expected. He was in a rush, distracted by the day's events at work, but as he approached the front door, something felt off. He noticed the door slightly ajar, just enough to make him pause. It wasn't uncommon for Rachel to leave the door open a crack when she was moving around the house, but tonight, it sent a shiver down his spine. He stood there for a moment, staring at the door, his mind racing. What happened next would forever change the course of their relationship. As he stepped through the door, he was met with an image he would never forget. Rachel, his wife, was in their living room, but she wasn't alone. Standing in front of her was someone John had trusted, someone he had looked up to for years, their pastor. John's heart dropped. His breath caught in his throat as he watched, frozen in disbelief. There, in their home, Rachel, his newlywed wife, was not just speaking to their pastor, not just sharing a casual conversation. No, She was engaged in an act so shocking, so deeply personal, that it felt like a betrayal of everything he believed in. His mind scrambled to make sense of what he was seeing, but no matter how hard he tried, the truth kept cutting through. Rachel and the pastor were in the middle of something that should never have happened. The image was seared into his memory. Rachel, her eyes wide with shock and something else. Guilt? But it was the pastor's face that stuck with John. A man he had known for years. A man who had been a guiding figure in his life. How could he be standing there, involved in something so intimate with the woman John had just married? This wasn't just a physical act. It was a violation of everything John held sacred. The betrayal went deeper than just the act itself. It was the destruction of trust, the unraveling of everything he thought he knew about the people closest to him. John stood in the doorway, his entire body tense with shock. His heart hammered in his chest as 1,000 thoughts collided in his mind, each one more jarring than the last. Could this be a misunderstanding? Was he imagining this? No, he wasn't imagining it. His eyes weren't deceiving him. This was real. His stomach twisted into knots as anger began to seep through the shock. He could feel his hands trembling, but his mind was clear. This was no accident. Rachel knew what she was doing. She had allowed this to happen. And the pastor, how could he? The man of God, the person John had trusted to guide him spiritually, was standing there, involved in something so vile, so utterly treacherous. The weight of that realization hit him like a sledgehammer. Rachel! The name burst from his lips, harsh and filled with disbelief. His voice sounded foreign, like it didn't even belong to him anymore. His legs finally moved, carrying him into the room, but the sight of her, his new wife, frozen in place, her face a mixture of fear and regret, only fueled the fire of anger that was beginning to rise within him. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice low but seething with fury. Rachel's eyes widened as she stood, her body stiff, a look of horror spreading across her face as she realized the truth of what had just been exposed. The pastor, for his part, stood frozen for a moment, clearly caught off guard by John's sudden appearance. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. John's eyes shifted between them, and he couldn't help but notice the tension, the way the two of them avoided each other's gazes. The room was thick with an air of unspoken guilt that neither of them could deny. Rachel took a slow, hesitant step toward John, her voice trembling as she spoke. "John, I can explain." But her words felt hollow, like they had no substance. The apology was already in her eyes, the regret, but the damage had been done. John wasn't listening anymore. His mind was racing with a cocktail of emotions. Betrayal, confusion, rage. He couldn't understand why she had done this. Why him? Why the pastor? He stepped back, shaking his head in disbelief, his chest tight with the weight of his anger. He couldn't look at her. He couldn't look at the man who had stood by him through thick and thin, the man who had married them. John felt as if the floor had been ripped out from under him, leaving him teetering on the edge of something dark and dangerous. Everything he thought he knew about Rachel, about the pastor, was being pulled apart, piece by piece. "No, I don't want to hear it." John spat, his voice rising, his hands clenching into fists. His mind screamed at him to walk away, to leave the house, to get away from the madness that had just consumed his life. But he couldn't. He couldn't look away from Rachel, even though every inch of his body wanted to run. He needed answers. He needed to know why. Rachel reached out for him, but he recoiled, stepping back as if her touch might burn him. "Please, John, just listen," she began, but he cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. "What do you want me to listen to, Rachel? That this was just a mistake? A moment of weakness? A lapse in judgment? Because I don't believe that for a second." His voice cracked with emotion. The anger now. He couldn't look away from Rachel, even though every inch of his body wanted to run. He needed answers. He needed to know why. Rachel reached out for him, but he recoiled, stepping back as if her touch might burn him. "Please, John, just listen," she began, but he cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. "What do you want me to listen to, Rachel? That this was just a mistake? A moment of weakness? A lapse in judgment? Because I don't believe that for a second. His voice cracked with emotion, the anger now boiling over into something more dangerous: desperation. How long, Rachel? How long has this been going on? The seconds felt like hours as John stood there, staring at Rachel. Her eyes, wide with guilt and fear, only fueled the fire inside him. How could she do this to him? How could she betray him so completely, so utterly? And how could the pastor, the man who had been like a father figure to him, be a part of this? Everything in John's body screamed at him to leave the room, to run from the scene unfolding before him, but he couldn't. His feet felt like lead, rooted to the floor, his body trembling with the force of the emotions warring inside him. He had loved Rachel. He had trusted her. But now, everything he thought he knew about their marriage, their life together, was shattered. He was standing on the precipice of something he couldn't take back. And Rachel, the woman he had promised to cherish, was standing in front of him, broken, her secrets laid bare. The room was suffocating. The air felt thick with unspoken words, and the tension was almost unbearable. John could feel the heat of his anger radiating through his chest as he stood there, struggling to comprehend what had just unfolded. Rachel, the woman he had married only days ago, stood in front of him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear, guilt, and regret. She was reaching out to him, her voice trembling as she tried to explain herself, but John wasn't listening. He couldn't hear her anymore. Rachel, how could you do this? John's voice cracked as he shouted, his words laced with raw emotion. The intensity in his voice shook the walls of the room, echoing the chaos that was building within him. He couldn't focus. His thoughts were spinning out of control. Every word she said seemed like a feeble attempt to cover up what she had done, and every plea felt like a slap in the face. It's not what you think, John. Please, just listen to me. Rachel's voice was soft, but desperate. She stepped closer, trying to close the distance between them, but it was as though her movements were in slow motion. John couldn't take it anymore. Every step she took toward him felt like an intrusion. He recoiled, stepping backward, as though her touch would burn him. Listen. John spat, his eyes wild with fury. You expect me to listen? After everything? After what you've done? His hands balled into fists, his whole body trembling with a rage he couldn't control. What the hell is going on, Rachel? What kind of sick game are you playing? Rachel's eyes filled with tears as she reached for him again, her voice cracking with desperation. John, please. It was a mistake. I never meant for it to happen. You have to believe me. But John couldn't believe her anymore. Not after what he had just seen. His mind replayed the image of her with the pastor, her body so close to his, the intimacy so raw, so personal. It didn't matter how much she pleaded. There was no way back from this betrayal. No way to fix what had been broken. The pastor, still standing in the corner of the room, seemed to shrink under the weight of the situation. He had been trying to calm John down, but the raw emotion pouring from him made it impossible. He stepped forward hesitantly, his voice low but steady, trying to insert some sense of authority into the escalating chaos. John, please, let's just talk about this, the pastor said, his tone calm, but filled with an unmistakable tension. We're all in shock here. We can work through this. John's eyes snapped toward him. The sight of the man who had been a spiritual guide, a trusted figure, standing there with a look of guilt painted across his face, was more than John could take. He took a step forward, his voice a low growl as he faced the pastor. You're going to tell me to calm down. John's voice was seething. You were supposed to be a man of God. You were supposed to protect her, guide her. You were supposed to be a role model, but instead you're standing here in my house, in my life, betraying me. You, of all people. The pastor's expression shifted, a flicker of shame flashing across his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words got caught in his throat. He couldn't deny what had happened. He couldn't explain it away. I'm sorry, John, the pastor stammered, his voice strained. I never meant for it to go this far. It was a moment of weakness. A moment of weakness? John interrupted, his words laced with disbelief. That's your excuse? A moment of weakness? You've ruined everything, and you think a half-hearted apology is enough. John's emotions were no longer something he could control. They had taken over, clouding his judgment and making him feel as though he was drowning in his own rage. The pastor's words, Rachel's pleas, none of it mattered anymore. All he could hear was the pounding of his heart, the roar of his anger, drowning out any logic or reason. He stepped back from them both, the room spinning as his mind raced. His breaths came in ragged gasps, every inhale burning like fire in his chest. Betrayal, hurt, confusion, they all swirled together inside of him, threatening to tear him apart. He couldn't think straight. He couldn't focus. His hands shook as he stumbled backward, his eyes darting around the room in search of something, anything, to anchor him. But the only thing he saw was the glint of the gun, lying on the dresser in the bedroom. His eyes locked onto it, and for a split second, everything went still. His mind went blank. The anger, the pain, the chaos, it all seemed to funnel toward one point, the gun. John's legs moved on their own, carrying him to the dresser as if he had no control over his own body. His hands trembled violently as he reached for the weapon, but he didn't hesitate. Gripping it tightly, he felt a strange sense of clarity, almost as if this was the only way to escape the overwhelming flood of emotions consuming him. His fingers wrapped around the cold metal, and he heard the familiar click of the safety being removed. For a moment, John stood there, the weight of the gun heavy in his hands, his mind a blur of confusion and rage. His thoughts became more scattered, fragmented. The room felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in on him. The gun was no longer just a weapon. It was his lifeline, his way out of the turmoil he couldn't escape. Rachel's voice, faint and pleading, reached his ears, but it was like she was speaking from another world. John, don't do this. Please put the gun down. You don't want this. We can work this out. But John didn't hear her. He couldn't hear her. His mind was consumed by one singular thought. This was the end of everything. The love he had felt, the life he thought he could have. It was all slipping away, and the anger, blinding, suffocating, was all he could feel. You betrayed me, he muttered under his breath, almost to himself. You both betrayed me. His emotions had completely spiraled out of control, and in that moment, his rage boiled over. It was no longer about confronting Rachel or understanding why the pastor had betrayed him. It was about the overwhelming need to release the pain, the hurt, the brokenness. His vision blurred, and all he could see was red. The room was frozen. Time seemed to stretch as John gripped the gun tighter, his whole body trembling with a mixture of anger, confusion, and pain. The sound of Rachel's voice pleading with him barely reached his ears. Everything felt muffled, as if the world outside had disappeared, leaving only the violent storm of emotions raging within him. His breath came in short, jagged gasps, and for a moment he hesitated. His finger brushed the trigger, and for a split second, he wondered if he could stop himself. Was there still a chance to pull back from the edge? But as he looked at Rachel, her face, full of regret but also defiance, as if she were still trying to justify her actions, something inside him snapped. His mind was no longer in control. It was as though he had become a passenger in his own body, unable to stop the destruction. The first shot rang out like thunder, so sudden and deafening that it felt as though the room itself had been torn apart. The sound of the gunshot reverberated off the walls, a sharp, jarring noise that seemed to stop time. Rachel's scream echoed through the space, but it was drowned out by the sound of John's own heartbeat thundering in his ears. The shock was instant, overwhelming. But John didn't stop. His finger, still gripped around the trigger, pulled again, and another shot rang out. Then another. Each shot tore through the air like a knife, and each bullet found its mark. Rachel's screams faded, but her body jolted with each impact. She stumbled backward, her legs giving way, but John's hand remained steady, his finger unyielding as he fired again. The gun seemed to have a life of its own. Each shot, each burst of noise, only deepened his fury. 10 shots. 10 shots to take the life of the woman he once loved. 10 shots that marked the death of a future they had once envisioned together. The room was filled with nothing but the deafening sounds of gunfire, the thudding of the bullets hitting their mark, and the desperate gasps of a woman who could no longer plead for mercy. John was lost to it, lost to the rage that had consumed him. There was no logic anymore, no reasoning. There was only the noise, the violence, and the irrevocable destruction of a life that had once been whole. When the final shot rang out, the room fell silent. The chaos was over, replaced by a stillness so profound it was suffocating. John stood there, the gun in his hand, still smoking from the last shot. His chest heaved with shallow breaths, as if he were just coming back to reality. But the reality was worse than anything he could have imagined. He looked down at Rachel. She was crumpled on the floor, her body still and lifeless, blood pooling around her in dark, spreading circles. Her eyes, once full of life, were now dull and empty, staring into nothing. Her face, twisted in pain, was frozen in time, as though her body had been caught in the final moment of shock. The woman he had married, the woman he had vowed to protect, was gone. John's hands shook violently as he stared at her, the gun still clutched in his trembling fingers. His mind couldn't process what had just happened. He had just taken her life. His thoughts became a blur. Guilt, regret, disbelief, but they were fleeting. What was left of his mind was consumed by the crushing weight of what he had done. But there was no time to dwell. The sound of sirens pierced the silence, growing louder with each passing second, pulling him out of the fog of his own emotional collapse. He didn't move. He stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to tear his eyes away from Rachel's body. The sound of the approaching sirens grew louder, and it was like a distant, detached noise, something happening far away, as though it weren't even real. But it was real. It was all too real. The seconds stretched into eternity as John's chest rose and fell, each breath more labored than the last. The weight of the gun in his hand felt impossibly heavy, as if the entire universe had shifted onto his shoulders. The sirens were closer now, blaring, urgent. And in that moment, the sound of the approaching sirens grew louder, and it was like a distant, detached noise, something happening far away, as though it weren't even real. But it was real. It was all too real. The seconds stretched into eternity as John's chest rose and fell, each breath more labored than the last. The weight of the gun in his hand felt impossibly heavy, as if the entire universe had shifted onto his shoulders. The sirens were closer now, blaring, urgent. And in that moment, John realized the horrifying truth. There was no going back. He had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. He had crossed a line that had ended Rachel's life and, in a way, had ended his own as well. The room, once filled with the chaos of emotion, was now eerily quiet, except for the wail of the approaching sirens. John stood frozen, his body shaking with the cold, overwhelming realization of what he had done. And still, his mind refused to accept it. His eyes never left Rachel's lifeless form, but they didn't see her anymore. They saw only the destruction he had wrought, the irreversible consequences of the choices he had made. It was over. The sirens had barely faded when the detectives arrived at the scene. They were met with a chilling sight. Rachel's lifeless body sprawled across the floor, blood staining the carpet. John sat in the corner, dazed, the gun still gripped in his hand, his eyes vacant, as though he were somewhere else entirely. His face was numb, the reality of what he had done yet to fully set in. The officers had to move quickly, but there was no mistaking the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just another domestic dispute gone wrong. It was something far darker, far more complicated. The detectives immediately secured the scene, working with practiced efficiency. The look on John's face, the absence of resistance when they took the gun from his hand, told them all they needed to know. But the deeper they dug, the more they realized this wasn't a simple act of rage. The dynamics of the relationship, the betrayal, the jealousy, all played a role in this tragic event. It was clear that the motives ran deeper than anyone had expected. The trial that followed was nothing short of shocking. John pleaded guilty, but his defense team argued that the murder wasn't premeditated. They painted him as a man driven to the edge by betrayal, claiming it was a crime of passion, an explosive reaction to the years of hidden tension and the discovery of his wife's affair. But the prosecution wasn't having it. They argued that this was a calculated act, that John's jealousy and suspicions had been festering for weeks, even months, and that the violence was a result of his escalating rage. Rachel's family was torn apart by the loss. Her parents, devastated by their daughter's death, sat in the courtroom, their grief palpable in every word they spoke. They wanted justice, but they also wanted answers. Why had John gone so far? Why hadn't he walked away from the situation before it escalated? And, of course, there was the pastor called to testify. The community was in turmoil as the question loomed over the proceedings. How much did he really know about the affair? Was he involved in something more than just a spiritual relationship with Rachel? The church, once a place of solace, had become the center of suspicion and scandal. For months, the trial dragged on, the air thick with tension. John's defense tried to humanize him, explaining the depths of his emotional collapse, but the jury wasn't swayed. In the end, they found him guilty of second-degree murder, acknowledging the heat of the moment but also recognizing the severity of his actions. The pastor's reputation was forever tarnished as well, as questions continued to swirl about his role in the affair and his relationship with Rachel. The community was fractured, and the fallout from that tragic night would haunt everyone involved for years to come. In the end, the aftermath was nothing short of devastating. Rachel's family was left to pick up the pieces, their grief compounded by the shocking and senseless way they lost their daughter. They had loved her, cherished her, and now they were forced to face a future without her. John, on the other hand, was left to live with the consequences of his unthinkable actions. The life he once knew, his marriage, his place in the community, was all gone in an instant. And though he had confessed, there would be no redemption from the irreversible damage he had done. The pastor, cleared of any direct wrongdoing in the eyes of the law, was nonetheless forever linked to the scandal. His reputation, once built on trust and respect, would never be the same. The betrayal of a man of God shook the faith of the very community that had relied on him for guidance. This tragic story serves as a sobering reminder that when love, trust, and faith are shattered, the results can be far more destructive than anyone could imagine. It's a reminder that unchecked jealousy, hidden secrets, and unresolved emotional turmoil can spiral into devastation, leaving behind broken lives and irreparable consequences. What do you think? Was this a crime of passion, or was there something darker at play? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want to hear more gripping true crime stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching.